When people outside Japan hear the word seppuku, they often picture the same scene. A samurai, calm, proud, choosing death with perfect self-control. A final act of honor. It's been romanticized for generations through novels, films, anime, and games, as if seppuku were the purest proof of courage. But history rarely fits into a beautiful story, because when you look closer, seppuku wasn't just a personal decision. In many cases, it was something far colder, a system, a punishment, and, at times, a tool of politics. So today, we're not here to glorify violence. We're here to understand what seppuku actually was, how it worked, who it was for, and why the idea of honor became attached to it. Because the most important question isn't, was seppuku brave? It's this, who benefited from calling it honorable? Chapter 1. Where did seppuku come from? A common misunderstanding is that seppuku naturally emerged from some timeless samurai spirit. But early on, seppuku was often tied to something much more practical and much darker, the battlefield. If capture meant humiliation, torture, or public display, some warriors chose death before that happened. In that context, seppuku wasn't a formal ritual. It wasn't a clean ceremonial act. It was an emergency decision, a way to avoid the worst possible ending in a harsh, status-based world. And that detail matters, because it means seppuku didn't begin as a beautiful symbol. It began as a brutal option inside a brutal reality. Then, as warfare decreased and society became more regulated, the act didn't disappear. Instead, it changed. Over time, seppuku became something else, something shaped and defined by authority, rules, and social order. In other words, seppuku wasn't simply born from honor. It was reframed by a system. Chapter 2. Seppuku as punishment. By the Edo period, seppuku was often treated as a formal punishment. And here's a key point that doesn't get said enough. Seppuku was not something everyone could do. It was not equally available to all people. In a strict class society, different groups faced different kinds of execution. Commoners might be punished publicly in ways designed to shame and deter. But for many members of the warrior class, seppuku could function as a kind of privileged death. Less public humiliation, more controlled procedure, a chance to preserve a family name, at least on paper. So even though seppuku is often described as a moral choice, it also operated as a form of class-based punishment, a penalty tied to status and rank. And once you see it that way, seppuku begins to look less like a personal philosophy and more like a mechanism for maintaining social order. Not a warrior proving courage, but a society enforcing hierarchy, even in death. Chapter 3. Was it really voluntary? Here's another myth. Because the person chooses to cut their own abdomen, people assume seppuku was voluntary. But in many cases, the choice was surrounded by invisible walls. If you refused an order to commit seppuku, the consequences could be catastrophic. Loss of status, loss of property, and, most importantly, damage to your family. In a world where your name wasn't just your identity, but your entire future, that kind of pressure is not a free choice. It becomes a forced bargain. If you die, your family might be spared. So we have to ask honestly, if the cost of refusing is the destruction of everyone you love, is that really freedom? Or is it a system that makes the person feel like they're choosing, even when the outcome has already been decided? Chapter 4. The part schools rarely explain. Kaishakunin. There's another detail that's often missing in simplified retellings. In many seppuku cases, there was a kaishakunin, an assistant, chosen to end the suffering, because the act of cutting the abdomen could be slow and unbearable. So the assistant would perform decapitation shortly after, to prevent prolonged agony. This is important for one reason. It shows that seppuku wasn't only about physical death. It was about creating a specific image of death. The meaning mattered more than the mechanics. In many cases, the core goal was to complete the form, to establish the narrative. He died with honor. He accepted responsibility. He preserved the order. That's why seppuku can feel so ritualized. It wasn't designed to be humane. It was designed to be symbolically effective, controlled, formal, and socially legible. A death that communicated a message. Chapter 5. Seppuku as politics. Now we reach the deepest layer. Why would a government maintain such a complex, controlled form of death? Because seppuku wasn't just punishment. It was psychological governance. It created a permanent pressure inside the warrior class. If you fail, if you disobey, if you threaten the system, you don't just die. Your name dies. Your household collapses. Your legacy becomes shame. And here's what makes it even more powerful. The official story can still claim you chose it. That's an incredibly sophisticated kind of control. The state doesn't always need constant violence in the streets. Instead, it builds a world where people internalize the rules and discipline themselves. In that sense, seppuku functioned as a deterrent, not only through fear, but through identity. It told the warrior class, you exist inside the system. Chapter 6. How seppuku was turned into a legend. So how did we end up with the romantic story? Part of the answer is peace. In long periods of relative stability, the warrior class faced a problem. If you're defined by war, what do you become when war disappears? In those conditions, symbolic acts gain power. Seppuku could become proof that samurai were still different, still morally elevated, still bound to a special code. And later, in modern eras, ideas about national spirit and cultural identity could reshape seppuku again, not as a punishment system, but as a dramatic symbol. Over time, the ritual's political and legal context faded from popular memory, while the myth grew louder. That's how you get the version that travels globally. A lone samurai, a clean, tragic decision. Honor above life. It's cinematic, but history is rarely that simple. Conclusion. What honor really meant. Understanding seppuku doesn't mean celebrating it. It means understanding how a society can use words like honor to manage behavior and to control people without always drawing a sword. Seppuku wasn't just about bravery. It was also about order, punishment, class, and power. And maybe that's why the topic still hits us today. Because even in modern life, we know what it feels like to be pressured by expectations that don't look like chains, but still limit your choices. So seppuku isn't only a story about death. It's a story about how people were made to live, how they were made to obey, and how the label of honor could turn coercion into something that looked like virtue. If you enjoyed this deeper look at Japanese history, the parts movies don't usually show, subscribe, because we're going further. And tell me in the comment, when you hear seppuku, do you think of honor,